Someone with your limited education couldn't possibly understand how real medicine works. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 47 minutes before the Army Ranger captain coded for the third time. Seattle General's trauma ward in Philadelphia hums with the particular frequency of organized chaos. Ventilators wheeze their mechanical rhythm, cardiac monitors beep in staggered syncopation, and the intercom crackles with codes that send staff moving like schooling fish responding to invisible current. Elena Martinez moves through it all with the kind of efficiency that comes from having performed triage under mortar fire, though no one here knows that. She wears scrubs the color of faded slate, her badge clipped to the left side, and her hands move with the precision of someone who learned that hesitation kills. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead as she enters Bed 7, where Captain Ryan Holt lies motionless beneath a white hospital blanket. 3 weeks in the trauma ward. Catastrophic traumatic brain injury from an IED strike in Ramadi. The medical summary lists the particulars in clinical language: Glasgow Coma Scale score of 7, multiple fractures of the left femur and tibia, pulmonary contusion, subdural hematoma requiring evacuation. What it doesn't say is that he carried her 4 kilometers through enemy territory with a shattered spine, or that she has no idea if he remembers her face, because he remembers nothing at all. Elena adjusts the fall line, the catheter is patent, flow running clear, and her eyes drift to his left forearm where the skin shows the permanent ink of her own name, E. Martinez, in block letters, faded and stretched across scar tissue like something precious that survived a fire. Her jaw tightens imperceptibly. She reaches toward her scrub pocket where the tarnished challenge coin rests, cold and heavy, then withdraws her hand before her fingers make contact. She begins her neuro checks with the kind of meticulous attention that makes her different from the other nurses on the ward. The Glasgow Coma Scale assessment. Pupil response, both reactive, equal and round. Extremity strength testing. But she also notices what the automated systems miss: the subtle irregularity in his cardiac rhythm, the way the monitor shows occasional PVCs, premature ventricular contractions, that spike the screen in brief, jagged interruptions before resolving back to normal sinus rhythm. The machines have flagged them as occasional artifact. Elena knows better. She's seen this pattern before. She knows what it means. Her hand steady as surgical steel, she documents the finding in his chart: 1847 hours, intermittent PVCs noted on continuous cardiac monitoring, duration 3 to 5 seconds, self-resolving. Recommend cardiology consultation. She writes the recommendation knowing full well that Dr. Whitfield will either ignore it or actively discourage it, depending on which option allows him to maintain the narrative that the captain's case is hopeless and should be managed as palliative care only. Nurse Martinez. The voice comes from behind her like a scalpel sliding between ribs. Dr. Whitfield stands in the doorway of Bed 7, his white coat pristine, his tie a shade of blue that probably cost more than Elena's monthly rent. He is 43 years old with the kind of jawline that could cut glass and the particular confidence of someone who has never been told no by anyone who mattered. His eyes narrow as he watches her chart. Doctor. She closes the chart and turns to face him, her voice carrying the careful deference she has perfected over 3 weeks of working beneath someone who views her as an obstacle to his authority rather than a colleague. I noticed you've been spending an unusual amount of time with this patient. He steps into the room, and the air pressure changes. Perhaps you're not aware that prolonged nursing attention on patients with futility status can create false hope in their families and interfere with the medical decision-making process. Elena's hands rest at her sides. The family hasn't visited in 8 days, doctor. And monitoring is standard protocol for any ICU patient. Standard protocol. He repeats the phrase as if it's something he's found on the bottom of his shoe. Of course. Tell me, in your nursing program, was it a 4-year university degree or something a bit more abbreviated? The question lands like a brick through glass. 2 nurses at the other end of the trauma ward pretend not to hear it. A resident who was walking past stops walking. Elena's jaw tightens imperceptibly. I have my RN credential from Johns Hopkins, doctor. Do you? He moves closer, his voice dropping to a volume that only she can hear but that somehow travels through the entire ward anyway. That's not what your credentialing file says. Community college program, transferred at the junior year level. Not quite the same pedigree, is it? He smiles then, a smile like a wolf showing its teeth. I've already had to call security once this week regarding your conduct on this ward. Twice would be unfortunate, but I'm not opposed to escalating if I see any further overreach. Elena says nothing. Silence is sometimes a weapon. Sometimes it's just self-preservation. He turns to leave, then pauses at the doorway. Chain of command exists for a reason, Nurse Martinez. It separates those who are qualified to make medical decisions from those who aren't. Do try to remember that. His footsteps echo down the corridor, the sound of his expensive shoes on tile fading toward the nurse's station. But that wasn't the worst part. 45 minutes later, Elena pushes the crash cart toward the vending machine on the third floor, a small pilgrimage she makes during her break to buy the same unsweetened black coffee she has bought every day for 3 weeks. The machine hums its low mechanical song as she feeds in $2 bills. Behind her, Dr. Whitfield appears as if conjured by the force of her concentration. I've been reviewing your patient interactions with Captain Holt, he says, his voice carrying the false warmth of someone who has already decided what he thinks and is now just performing the act of communication. The neuro checks you're documenting are substantially more detailed than what the protocol requires. The cardiac assessments are likewise exceeding your scope. Elena retrieves her coffee. The cup is warm against her palms. I'm simply following the nursing protocols as written, Doctor. Are you? He leans against the vending machine with the casual dominance of someone who has never questioned his right to occupy space. Because what I see is a nurse with a high school diploma foundation attempting to perform clinical assessments that require medical training. The cardiac monitoring recommendations you made this morning, for instance. Completely unnecessary. The patient is in organ failure. His brain stem is deteriorating. Cardiology consults at this stage are exercises in futility. Elena says nothing. She sips her coffee. The taste is exactly what she expects, bitter, hot, true. I've worked with some very capable nurses over the years, Whitfield continues, but there's always a line between nursing and practicing medicine without a license. That line protects patients. It also protects nurses who might otherwise make mistakes that hurt people. He pauses, letting the implication settle. I'm going to be monitoring your work very closely now. Very closely indeed. Elena meets his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. I understand. Do you? His smile returns. I genuinely hope so, because the next time I find evidence of you overstepping your role, I won't be making polite suggestions. I'll be making calls. To my colleagues on the hospital board. To the State Nursing Board. To the Credential Review Committee. I have relationships that span multiple institutions, Nurse Martinez. One phone call from me can affect your career trajectory in ways you might not find pleasant. He walks away before she can respond, leaving her standing alone by the vending machine with her coffee cooling in her hands and the particular knowledge that she is being hunted by someone who has no idea what he's hunting. She returns to the trauma ward at 19:03 hours. The fluorescent lights buzz their constant frequency overhead. The monitors beep their rhythmic confirmation that Captain Holt is still breathing, still living, still trapped in the darkness behind his closed eyes. Elena checks his foresight, adjusts the ventilator settings, and performs her neuro checks with the same meticulous precision that is apparently both her strength and her crime. His left forearm rests on top of the blanket. Martinez. The letters are dark enough to see even in the dim light of the trauma ward. She allows her eyes to rest on them for exactly 3 seconds. Then she moves to the next patient, the next set of vital signs, the next documentation that someone somewhere will later use to judge her competence. But there was something happening inside Captain Holt's chest that the machines hadn't yet learned to read correctly. Something in the electrical system of his heart that was beginning to fail. Elena could see it in the patterns the monitor displayed. She could feel it in the way the case was moving toward crisis. She could sense it the way apex predators sense wounded prey, not with judgment, but with pure, automatic recognition of what was coming. 7 doctors would eventually refuse this case. 7 would declare it futility. 7 would turn away. But Elena noticed things the machines missed. Elena was already watching. Elena was already waiting. That was the real nightmare beginning. Grand rounds began at 0800 hours in the amphitheater, and Elena already knew how it would end. 20 residents arranged in ascending rows like a Roman Colosseum, Dr. Whitfield at the lectern with his laser pointer glowing red, and her patient's entire medical history projected onto the massive screen behind him. She stood at the back wall where he'd specifically requested she observe, where the light wouldn't catch her face, where she could disappear into the white coat crowd if she needed to. She didn't need to. Whitfield circled her documentation entries with the red laser pointer, his voice carrying that particular pedagogical condescension reserved for teaching moments he'd carefully staged. "Here we have a textbook example of what we call nursing overreach," he announced, letting the phrase hang in the sterile air like an indictment. "Note how Nurse Martinez, or should I say Nurse Nightingale here, has documented what she calls microfocal seizure activity that somehow escaped the notice of her attending neurologists." He paused for effect. The residents laughed on cue, a polished rehearsal of hierarchy. Elena didn't blink. Her hands were clasped behind her back in parade rest, the kind of stillness that comes from having held it through worse things than condescension. Whitfield continued, pointing to her repositioning notes with the red dot dancing across the screen like a tiny laser rifle. "She's also implemented a proprietary repositioning protocol, very creative for someone whose highest credential is an associate degree from a community college." The laughter came again, more confident this time, the residents emboldened by their attending's permission to mock. Her jaw muscle flexed once, a single involuntary twitch like a trigger finger remembering itself. That was all. Whitfield made direct eye contact with her from 15 feet away, his smile the kind that appears when a predator has cornered something it believes is helpless. Perhaps in whatever clinic you worked before, nurses played doctor. Here at Seattle General, we maintain professional boundaries. Elena nodded once, clinically, and made a note on her tablet. The stylus moved with absolute steadiness. Her hands were not trembling. Her voice, when she spoke into the silence of her own breathing, remained at parade rest inside her chest, understood. The amphitheater dissolved back into its normal chaos of rounds and vital sign reviews, but Whitfield's focus on her had sharpened into something more dangerous than ridicule. This was strategy now. This was a man beginning to understand that public humiliation wasn't working, that her composure under his assault had somehow inverted the dynamic, and he was a competitor who did not tolerate losing audience control. 2 hours later, Elena found him waiting at the third-floor vending machine, positioned as though by accident though she'd learned to read the geometry of ambushes years ago. He was alone this time, but the physical therapy staff working at the adjacent station meant every word would carry weight and witness. "Listen, Nightingale," Whitfield said, his voice dropping into that false intimate register that was actually a threat broadcast to an audience. "I've already called security once this week about your unauthorized presence in the ICU after your shift. Next time I won't hesitate." He leaned closer, his breath sharp with coffee and something acidic, the smell of a man who'd skipped breakfast to prepare this encounter. "Between you and me, someone with your limited education really shouldn't try to play in the big leagues. You understand chain of command, right? Or did they not cover that in your online nursing program?" Elena selected a granola bar from the vending machine. Her hands were completely steady. She swiped her badge card with a kind of deliberate precision that made every movement visible, swiped again when it rejected the first attempt, retrieved her purchase, and turned toward the corridor. She didn't speak. She didn't meet his eyes. She simply walked past him with the kind of measured distance that suggested he was not even there, which was, she understood, a far more effective weapon than anything words could provide. But the PT staff had seen it. They'd seen Whitfield lean into space and find nothing to lean against. They'd seen him left standing alone in the reflection of the vending machine glass, his face recalibrating from predatory to something resembling shock. 90 seconds later, Elena pressed her forehead against the cold metal shelving in the supply closet, her breath coming in controlled cycles that she'd learned in places where breathing wrong meant death. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the accumulation of 6 hours of listening to someone dismantle her in front of an audience while her patient lay in bed 7 with her name tattooed on his left forearm, invisible under his bandages, a ghost of a memory he no longer possessed. She allowed herself exactly 3 shaking breaths. 1, 2, 3. Then her spine realigned, her breathing normalized, and she stepped back into the fluorescent corridor light as though nothing had occurred. The supply closet clicked shut behind her. Elena returned to rounds. But what she didn't know was that Whitfield had moved beyond performance. At 18:47 hours, while she documented Captain Holt's afternoon vital signs, he made the first call. Dr. Patricia Carlisle, the board member whose daughter worked in pediatric oncology, the one who owed Whitfield a favor from his testimony at her malpractice defense 3 years ago. "Patricia, I'm concerned about a staff member at your hospital," Whitfield said, his voice shaped into something that sounded like professional responsibility. "A nurse with significant credential gaps who's been demonstrating concerning judgment patterns. I think you'll want to be aware before something serious happens." He didn't need to say more. The board member made her own calls after that. The second call came at 19:23 hours to Mercy General in Chicago, where Elena had worked before Seattle. Requesting her employment records. Requesting documentation of any prior performance issues, any complaints, any evidence of boundary violations. The HR director there remembered the gaps in her work history, the month she'd simply disappeared, the way she'd never listed references from before 2008. No one questioned it at the time because she'd been excellent, exemplary, actually, the kind of nurse that disappeared into crisis and emerged with lives preserved, but there were always those gaps, those silences, that sense that parts of her history were classified by time rather than law. The third call came at 2001 hours to the State Nursing Board office in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. A formal request to investigate allegations of practicing beyond scope of practice, of implementing unauthorized protocols, of potentially falsifying medical documentation. This one would take longer, but it would move like a slow infection through systems designed to protect the public but that equally protected people like Whitfield from people like her. Elena was unaware of all 3. She was focused on Captain Holt's monitor readings, the subtle variations in cardiac rhythm that the machines weren't flagging as significant, but her hands that had held lives together in places where the light came from muzzle flashes, understood as warnings. At 18:40 hours, the patterns began. Subtle at first, a micro-variation in the RR intervals, the timing between heartbeats shifting by fractions of seconds, the kind of change that machines miss but that bodies understand as the beginning of electrical chaos. She paged neurology. The residents came. Whitfield arrived first, Dr. Chen from cardiology following, and the public dismissal began again, this time in bed 7's cubicle where the machines beeped their mechanical rhythm like backup singers in a play staged for an audience of monitors and alarms. "Nurse Nightingale sees things again," Whitfield announced to Chen, his tone suggesting she was experiencing a psychological episode rather than clinical observation. "The monitors show normal sinus rhythm, but apparently her intuition supersedes our technology." Chen examined the readouts with the confident disinterest of someone who had no investment in the outcome. The machine said he was fine. Therefore he was fine. Machines did not lie, and more importantly, machines absolved doctors from the cognitive labor of disagreeing with instruments. Elena pulled up the trend data, pointed to the micro-variations in the waveform. Her finger traced the pattern across the screen, steady as a laser, precise as surgery. Here and here. The RR intervals are shortening by 0.03 seconds every cycle. He's building toward VTAC. His heart is beginning to organize chaos. She said it in the voice of someone reporting fact, not prediction. The difference mattered. Whitfield actually laughed. The sound was like a door slamming. "You're reading arrhythmia predictors now? That's adorable. Dr. Chen, what's your clinical assessment?" Chen glanced at Elena, then at Whitfield, a creature aware of which direction power flowed. "Patient appears stable. No intervention indicated." Whitfield turned back to Elena with the kind of smile that precedes the ending of things. "Document your observations if you must, but do not page specialists again without attending approval." That's a direct order. He made a note on his tablet, the stylus moving with visible satisfaction. Initiating performance documentation for repeated boundary violations. This needs to be formal. This needs to end. As he and Chen left the bedside, Elena pulled the crash cart closer to bed 7 anyway. It was a subtle act, invisible to anyone not watching, just a nurse moving equipment, just standard precaution, just the kind of thing no one would notice until it was too late to argue about whether she'd had permission. Captain Holt's monitors continued their mechanical breathing, unaware that his heart was organizing a mutiny. At 2,145 hours, Elena discovered the phone calls while searching the hospital directory for Dr. Chen's direct line. A nurse she knew in administration mentioned casually that Dr. Whitfield had requested her personnel file. Another mentioned the State Board inquiry. The third mentioned Patricia Carlisle asking questions. She understood, in the way one understands when entering a minefield, that the ground beneath her feet had become dangerous. But understanding danger and changing course were different things. Captain Holt's vital signs were deteriorating incrementally, and no law, no professional boundary, no state board could reorder her priority structure. At 2,147 hours, his heart began to fail. At 01 for 7 hours, the monitor's rhythm collapsed like a building implosion, wide and irregular, then faster, then chaos. Elena heard it from the medication cart where she was restocking syringes, and her body moved before her mind finished processing. The alarm screamed. Not a gentle alert. A full code blue wail that turned every head on the night shift toward bed 7. She was there in 3 seconds. Captain Holt's chest heaved once, twice, then nothing. His oxygen saturation tanked. 78. 65. 52. The numbers fell like a stone down a well. Elena's hand found the call button. Code blue, bed 7. All attending physicians stat. Her voice was level, the voice of someone who'd called codes in sandstorms while mortar fire painted the walls. Respiratory, cardiology, stand by. The first doctor arrived in 90 seconds. Dr. Chen from emergency medicine, still buttoning his white coat as he moved. Then Dr. Patel, Rodriguez from surgery, and within 5 minutes the room had compressed into controlled chaos. Dr. Kim. Dr. Stevens from internal medicine. Dr. Walsh from critical care. 7 attending physicians total, all converging on the impossible task of resurrecting a man whose brain had been classified as non-salvageable for 3 weeks. Elena was already moving. 18 minutes down, she called, watching the monitor flatline into asystole, the worst rhythm, the one that means the heart has stopped entirely. Not fibrillating. Not twitching. Dead. No spontaneous activity for 2 minutes prior to alarm. Dr. Whitfield swept in last, his presence like cold air through an open window. He took position at the head of the bed without acknowledging Elena's presence. Epinephrine, 1 milligram 4 push, he ordered. His voice had the texture of ice cracking on a frozen river. Elena already had the syringe loaded. She watched the medication disappear into the central line. Watched the monitor. Waited. 30 seconds. 45. The line remained flat, relentless, indifferent to 7 doctorates worth of expertise standing in that room. Dr. Rodriguez was compressions, his hands locked in position on the captain's sternum, counting aloud, 21, 22, 23. The rhythm of pushing life into a dead man. It was intimate work, violent work, the kind of thing you only saw in hospitals at 3 in the morning when hope was the only currency anyone accepted. 18 minutes. The captain had been down for 18 minutes. Elena stood to the left of the bed, tracking vitals, preparing for what might come next, ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, bypassing the heart entirely and oxygenating blood outside the body. She'd prepped the cart before the code even started. Muscle memory. Prediction. The kind of preparation that only comes from reading someone's disease like a book written in their blood pressure and chest x-rays. Dr. Patel called out, no change. Still asystole. Another round of epinephrine. Another 2 minutes of compressions. Dr. Kim's forehead beaded with sweat. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical hymn above the bed, indifferent to the battle happening beneath them. 19 minutes. Second epi-dose, Whitfield commanded. His eyes never moved from the monitor. Check rhythm. Elena watched. Waited. The monitor screen showed what it always showed, the flat line that meant all was lost. She'd seen this before. Not in a hospital. In Ramadi, with a soldier whose spine had been fractured by shrapnel, his heart already failing, and Elena carrying him for miles through enemy fire with nothing but will and trauma training keeping him alive long enough to reach a forward operating base. That man. This captain. The one with her name tattooed on his arm. The one who'd given her the challenge coin, the one she'd pressed back into his palm before disappearing into civilian life under government orders. 20 minutes down. Dr. Stevens leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Catastrophic brain injury, he said quietly. Multiple organ failure. 19 minutes of no perfusion. 20 minutes, Dr. Walsh corrected, checking his watch. His voice had the tone of someone reading a death certificate aloud. Complete cardiac arrest. Asystole. Dr. Whitfield's jaw tightened. He stepped back from the bed. 1 step. 2. His presence shifted from engaged to disengaging. Elena recognized the micro-movement, the subtle signal that his mind had already moved to paperwork and time of death and the next patient waiting in the hallway. Continue compressions, he said. It wasn't a command. It was a courtesy. A final gesture before he announced what everyone else in the room was thinking. Dr. Patel was first. It's futile, he said. The word hung in the room like smoke. 21 minutes. No response to medications. No organized rhythm. Catastrophic starting injury. Dr. Rodriguez nodded, still counting compressions. Agreed. We've done everything indicated. Time to consider. Unsalvageable, Dr. Kim said. Not a question. A statement. A diagnosis of inevitability. One by one, the voices came. Each one a piece of the decision being made, the unanimous agreement settling over the room like weight pressing down from above. Nothing more we can do. Futility protocols apply. I concur. Time to call it. The voices weren't cruel. That was what made it harder. They were professional. Educated. Correct, by every medical standard, every protocol, every guideline that governed what you could and could not do for a patient whose body had given up entirely. Dr. Whitfield checked his watch again. The gesture was deliberate. Visible. A performance of authority and finality. Time of death, he announced, his voice cutting through the mechanical sounds of the hospital, 0205 hours. The compression stopped. Dr. Rodriguez stepped back. The room exhaled, the collective releasing of breath that comes when everyone finally agrees that the fight is over. Elena watched the monitor show the same flat line it had shown for 21 minutes. Nothing had changed except the decision to accept it. Whitfield turned to her. His eyes found hers across the body of Captain Holt, across the equipment and lines and the machinery of attempted resurrection. His expression was controlled, the expression of a man who had done his job correctly, professionally, with appropriate clinical judgment. Nurse Martinez, he said, his voice measured and precise, document time of death and prepare the body for the morgue. That is not a request. He turned toward the door. Dr. Chen followed. Then Dr. Patel. The exodus was beginning, the professional movement away from a lost case, toward the next patient, the next opportunity to save a life that might actually be savable. Elena's eyes dropped to the small plastic belongings tray beside the bed. The tarnished coin lay there among the items removed during Captain Holt's first surgery weeks ago. Silver, worn smooth, marked with an insignia she could read blindfolded. The same coin she'd pressed into a soldier's palm in Ramadi before carrying him through fire. She looked back up. "I'm scrubbing in," she said. The room froze. 7 bodies stopped moving simultaneously. 7 faces turned. 7 sets of eyes, attending physicians, leaders, men and women with the authority and credential to decide what was possible and what was not, fixed on the night shift nurse standing at the bedside of a dead man. Whitfield's hand paused on the doorframe. When he turned back, his expression had hardened into something colder. "Excuse me." "I'm opening his chest." Elena's voice was steady. It was the voice of someone stating fact, not requesting permission. Direct cardiac massage. Manual intervention. Absolutely not. Whitfield moved back toward the bed with the fluid precision of someone reclaiming control. That patient is deceased. The code is terminated. All 7 of us have, he gestured to the other physicians, all of whom were watching with expressions ranging from shock to professional disapproval. We have collectively determined that further intervention would violate futility protocols and cause unnecessary trauma to the body. You will stand down, document time of death, and prepare the corpse for the morgue. Elena was already moving toward the sink, her hands reaching for the surgical brush. He's not gone yet. He's been down for 21 minutes, Dr. Chen said gently, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone who didn't understand. Anoxic brain injury is irreversible after 5 to 10 minutes. He's gone, Dr. Patel finished. Legally and clinically, he's gone. Whitfield's voice dropped. It became the texture of broken ice, sharp at the edges, dangerous in the fractures. If you touch that patient, I will have security remove you from this hospital in handcuffs. You will be terminated for gross insubordination. You will lose your license. Do you understand me? Elena's hands were already under the surgical soap. The water ran warm, almost too warm, the kind of temperature you use when you're washing away more than just dirt. She scrubbed methodically. Between the fingers. Under the nails. The creases of her palms, hands that had been trained to hold things together, to rebuild what was broken, to refuse the verdict when the verdict was death. He had no idea who he was threatening. The first-year resident, Dr. Ames, stood frozen in the doorway. 27 years old, 3 months into her first postgraduate year, her eyes wide as she watched a night shift nurse defy 7 attending physicians simultaneously. Her mouth opened. Closed. She had no authority here. No standing. Nothing but witness. Elena grabbed a sterile towel and dried her hands with movements that looked rehearsed, because they were. 8 years of practice, buried under civilian work, under night shifts and drug calculations and the careful performance of being someone small. Someone deferential. Someone who accepted the hierarchies and the credentials and the authority structure that said a nurse was not qualified to make the decisions that only doctors could make. She'd learned hierarchy differently, in a place where rank meant survival and protocol meant the difference between leaving someone behind and bringing them home. "Get me a scalpel," she said. Not a request. A command. The voice that came out was not the voice of the timid nurse Whitfield had been humiliating at grand rounds and vending machines. It was older. Trained. Forged in places that didn't appear on any civilian resume. Dr. Rodriguez, who had been performing compressions minutes earlier, instinctively reached for the surgical instrument tray. "Stand down," Whitfield ordered, his voice becoming sharp with rising anger. "Nobody touches anything. Nobody assists this woman. She is committing gross misconduct. She is violating every protocol, every guideline, every standard of care in this institution." Elena's fingers closed around the scalpel. The weight of it was right. The balance was right. She'd held this same tool in combat medical situations, and the muscle memory didn't care about credentials or protocols or the opinions of 7 men with advanced degrees and hospital authority. She positioned the scalpel at the junction between the 4th and 5th ribs, left side, anterolateral. The path that led directly to the heart. "What the hell are you doing?" Dr. Walsh's voice cracked slightly. He was younger than Whitfield, less certain of his authority. He reached forward as if to stop her, then seemed to remember that he had no actual power to do so. A nurse had autonomy in her own hands. The law was murky. The protocol was clear. The reality was somewhere in between, and nobody wanted to be the one to physically restrain her. Elena did not hesitate. The scalpel cut through skin and subcutaneous tissue in one smooth motion. Blood followed, dark and immediate, pooling onto the surgical drape. The room smelled like copper and antiseptic, the sharp tang of emergency replacing the stale hospital air. Whitfield stepped toward her. "I am calling security right now." "Then call them," Elena said. She widened the incision, her hands moving with the certainty of someone who had done this under fire, under mortar, with no sterile field and no backup and nothing but the knowledge that the alternative was leaving someone to die. "But I'm opening his chest first." She found the rib spreader and positioned it. The mechanical click as she cranked it open, spreading the ribs, exposing the cardiac cavity. The captain's heart lay there still, silent, a muscle that had stopped believing in rhythm. Elena's hand entered the chest cavity. The room went absolutely still. Even Whitfield, even in the midst of his fury, seemed to realize he was watching someone cross a line that, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. A nurse. A woman who had been told she wasn't educated enough, wasn't authorized enough, wasn't qualified enough. Opening a man's chest with her bare hands while 7 attending physicians stood watching. Dr. Ames in the doorway raised her hand to her mouth. Elena's fingers found the heart. Wrapped around it. Began the direct cardiac massage, manual compression, the oldest emergency technique, the one that said, "I will not accept your verdict. I will not accept your collective decision. I will push life back into this man with my own hands if that's what it takes." The heart was cold. Asystolic. Unresponsive. She compressed anyway. Once. Twice. 3 times. The chamber walls contracted under her fingers. She could feel the anatomy, the architecture of the human heart that no textbook could truly teach, that only came from training your hands to understand what your mind might doubt. 25 seconds. 30. The monitor still showed flat line. Whitfield's voice came from the doorway, where he was reaching for his phone. "Security to bed 7. Code 999. Nurse assault to patient and physician interference. Stat." Elena didn't stop. Her hand continued the compression. The rhythm was starting to matter less than the message, "I am not leaving this man dead. Not when I'm the one standing here." 35 seconds. 40. 1 hour after Elena's hands released Captain Holt's heart back to its own rhythm, his vitals stabilized. Blood pressure climbed from 70/0 to 94/58. Oxygen saturation rose from 68 to 97%. Sinus rhythm held steady on the monitor like a second chance being written in real time. The resident, Dr. Ames, stood frozen in the doorway for 30 seconds after Elena stepped back, her scrubs drenched the color of rust, and then he moved, finally moved, to call it in. Code called. Patient salvaged. Impossible patient now impossible to ignore. But Elena was already being erased. Whitfield had activated his network the moment security arrived at the crash cart. His phone glowed in the pre-dawn darkness like a surgeon's light over a wound. For calls before 0200 hours. Board member Patricia Hayes, who'd invested in his private practice startup for years ago. Board member David Sterling, who owed him a favor after Whitfield had covered his gambling debts with a quiet cash transfer. Board member Eleanor Conrad, whose daughter had been residency matched through a program Whitfield chaired. Board member Thomas Bennett, who'd gotten his administrative position through Whitfield's recommendation to the hospital CEO. By 0230 hours, the first email had arrived in hospital HR, flagged urgent. By 0300 hours, his phone call to the state nursing board had been documented. By 0400 hours, he'd retrieved Elena's employment records from her previous hospital in San Diego, and found nothing. No complaints. No incidents. 12 years of exemplary performance at Mercy General, commendations from 4 different department heads, 0 disciplinary action. which meant he had to bury those records before the board could see them. He made the calls to HR at 0430 hours. By 0500 hours, an official investigation had been opened. The charge, practicing medicine without a license. The secondary charge, gross insubordination. The tertiary charge, violating direct orders from 7 attending physicians. 7. He made sure to use that exact number when he spoke to the board members. 7 doctors had said no. 7. And a nurse had decided she knew better. What he didn't know was that those 7 doctors would spend the next 8 hours talking to each other, comparing notes, realizing that every single one of them had felt that moment of hesitation when they saw her standing over that open chest with a calmness that belonged in an operating room, not a crash cart. What he didn't know was that Dr. Chen had already called the chief of medicine. What he didn't know was that Dr. Patel was preparing a statement about what she'd actually witnessed. What he didn't know was that his own investigation had a timer on it, and that timer was about to explode. At 0558 hours, 2 security guards escorted Elena from the patient care area. Whitfield followed them down the hallway, his phone still glowing, ready with the official language. The morning shift had begun, arriving, 12 nurses, for residents, 2 attending physicians. They watched in absolute silence as Whitfield positioned himself beside the security guards, as if he needed protection from the woman standing in front of him with blood up to her elbows and no expression on her face. "Nurse Martinez, you are suspended pending investigation." His voice carried the satisfaction of someone watching dominoes fall in slow motion. Gross insubordination, practicing medicine without a license, and violating direct orders from 7 attending physicians. Badge and access card. Now. Elena didn't respond with words. She never did. Instead, she reached up to her collar where the badge hung from its lanyard, a simple photograph, a name printed in capital letters, a barcode that had opened doors for 8 years. She unclipped it. The plastic was still warm from her body heat. She looked at it for exactly 1 second, long enough for someone to know she was saying goodbye to something, and then she extended it toward the nearest security guard. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. Her jaw didn't tighten. She was a stone that had learned to breathe. "My access card is upstairs," she said. Her voice was level as water. "I'll need to retrieve it." "We'll retrieve it," the guard said. She nodded once. She turned. She walked out through the main entrance at 0612 hours, and not a single person followed her. Not because they didn't want to, but because nobody knew what to say to a woman who'd just saved a life and lost everything in the same breath. The rain had started sometime around 0530 hours. It fell on Philadelphia in sheets, the kind of rain that came from the Atlantic with nothing to slow it down, hammering the parking lot like applause for a performance no one had wanted to see. Elena walked through it without hurrying. The water soaked through her scrubs and found the blood underneath, turning it from rust-dark to transparent, washing away the evidence of what her hands had done. She drove to Jack's Corner Diner because it was open at 3 in the morning and because it was empty except for the cook and 1 customer in a booth near the window. She ordered coffee. Black. She sat facing the glass, and she watched the rain, and she waited for the sun to come up because that's what you did when your entire life had been written in classified documents that nobody was allowed to read. The coffee was cold now. Had been cold for hours. Steam had stopped rising from the cup at least 40 minutes ago, and Elena hadn't touched it since. She stared at her reflection in the window glass instead, a face that belonged to a woman named Elena Martinez, a nurse who'd worked at Seattle General for 8 years, a woman with a recommendation letter from Mercy General and a driver's license and a studio apartment in northeast Philadelphia. She stared at the other face beneath that one. The one that existed in black files and classified briefings. Master Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez, Naval Special Warfare Development Group. The face that had rappelled into a compound in Ramadi at 01 for 7 hours on a night that no longer existed. The face that had led 7 other operators through 3 kilometers of hostile territory with 8 wounded soldiers they were dragging behind them like anchors in an ocean. The face that had carried Captain Ryan Holt, then Lieutenant Ryan Holt, 8 kilometers with a fractured spine and a shattered pelvis while rounds snapped overhead like angry hornets. The classified operation had erased 23 operatives from existence. 23 men and women whose names had been struck from every database, whose photographs had been removed from every official record, whose families had been told nothing except that their loved ones had died and could not be discussed. Master Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez had officially died in 2008. She'd been given a new social security number, a new birth certificate, a new civilian identity, and a single standing order: disappear. Never surface. Never claim the rank. Never speak about what happened in Ramadi. She had obeyed that order for 8 years. She had become invisible. She had learned to be small, to be quiet, to be the kind of nurse that people overlooked until they needed her. She had carried Captain Holt's challenge coin in her scrub pocket every single day, a tarnished coin from the night she'd carried him out of Ramadi, a coin he'd pressed into her hand in the darkness and told her never to lose. She had kept it like a promise. Like a prayer. Like evidence that some part of what happened that night had been real. And then she had watched him die on a monitor in a hospital where nobody knew who she was, and muscle memory had taken over. Muscle memory, and something deeper than muscle. Something that lived in the part of her that hadn't actually disappeared in 2008, no matter what the official document said. The diner's door chime rang at 03 for 7 hours. The bell had a high, hollow sound, the kind of sound that cut through empty spaces. Elena didn't look. Another customer arrived. The cook called out a greeting. The rain continued hammering the parking lot like a demand for something it would never receive. She thought about the moment she'd felt Captain Holt's heart respond to her hands. Felt the muscle tissue shift. Felt it wake up like something remembering its purpose. Muscle memory recognizing muscle memory. Her hands understanding something that her brain wasn't allowed to know it understood. That 23 erased operatives had trained to do exactly one thing: keep people alive when the mathematics said they should be dead. Keep them alive anyway. Defy the odds. Defy orders. Defy the laws of survival and physics and logic, and do it with such absolute precision that 7 doctors would stand in a conference room days later and struggle to explain what they'd witnessed. But that came later. Right now, at 03 for 7 hours, in an empty diner in Philadelphia, Elena Martinez drank cold coffee and watched her own reflection and accepted the cost of staying invisible. The rain kept falling. The cook went back to the kitchen. The bell on the door would ring again in a few hours when the morning crowd started arriving, but Elena wouldn't still be there. She would be in her apartment, reading the termination email that had already been sent to her personal inbox. She would be deleting her access codes from her phone. She would be lying in bed and counting the hours until someone would come looking for her, because people like her didn't stay hidden forever. Eventually, the machines always caught up with them. Eventually, the truth escaped from the classified files. She just didn't know it would happen in the next 18 hours. She didn't know the former insurgent fighter would be wheeled into Seattle General at 1,520 hours the next day. She didn't know that Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Webb would be standing in the second-floor hallway. She didn't know that General Patricia Vance would be landing at Philadelphia International with a classified personnel file and the authority to change everything. All she knew right now was that the rain would stop eventually. That the sun would come up. That she would survive this like she'd survived everything else, because the people who learned to disappear always got good at surviving. The bell on the diner door chimed again. Elena didn't look up. The diner door chimed again. Elena didn't look up. But the man in the wheelchair being pushed through the entrance froze, his eyes going wide as they swept across the sparse tables and found her. Not the man in the wheelchair. The man beside it. The man in the asylum seeker's jacket, his weathered face pale under fluorescent lights that buzzed like insects trapped in glass. He locked eyes with Elena. His lips moved. One word. Whispered in Arabic. Al-Malik al-Dami. The blood angel. Elena's coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. The cup trembled. Not her hand. The cup. She set it down without drinking, her eyes never leaving his. 8 years. 8 years since Ramadi. 8 years since she'd been ordered to disappear into civilian life and never surface, never claimed the rank she'd bled for, and now here stood someone who'd only ever known her as the Phantom in night vision and gun smoke. He knew. He knew exactly who she was. The man was still staring at her when Seattle General's veteran security guard, a former gunnery sergeant named Clayton Holloway who'd served 2 tours with 1st SFOD Delta, rolled the new patient through the ER doors at 08 for 7 hours the next morning. Holloway's face went rigid. He'd heard the stories. Every operator had. The woman who'd carved through a stronghold that was supposed to be unbreachable. The operator who carried a 210-pound Ranger 8 kilometers through enemy territory with a shattered spine, moving at night through Sanjin Valley territory that would have killed anyone else before the first kilometer. He turned to his radio, but his voice didn't whisper. It announced. Loud enough for every nurse, every resident, every attending physician in the trauma bay to hear. That's Master Chief Petty Officer Martinez. Naval Special Warfare. The hallway froze. Elena was standing at the medication dispensary 15 feet away, her hand still raised toward the cabinet lock. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. She didn't do anything that would draw attention. But Holloway was already making calls, and his voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent 23 years enforcing the proper order of things. By 0950 hours, General Lawrence Vance walked through Seattle General's main entrance in dress blues, his 2-star insignia catching the morning light like polished steel. Behind him came Colonel James Torres, his military liaison officer, carrying a sealed folder stamped secret, no fawn. They moved directly to the hospital board conference room without stopping for coffee. Without stopping at all. Dr. Patricia Carlisle, the board chairwoman, was the first to crack. She sat in that conference room reading Elena's actual service jacket, not the fabricated civilian nursing resume she'd been handed when Elena was hired, but the real document. 3 Bronze Stars. Consecutive deployments. 2 Purple Hearts. Meritorious Service Medal. And at the bottom, in redding that seemed to bleed across the page, critical asset. Ongoing national security operation. Civilian cover authorized by SOCOM, Office of Naval Intelligence. Contact breach constitutes federal violation 18 U.S.C. Section 641. General Vance's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Elena Martinez saved your hospital from liability yesterday morning. She performed an emergency procedure that your 7 attending physicians had collectively abandoned as futile. That patient upstairs, Captain Ryan Holt, carries intelligence regarding the Ramadi operation that cannot be lost. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Dr. Whitfield, your suspension of Master Chief Martinez constituted obstruction of a military asset operating under protected status. Her civilian cover was authorized at the highest levels of the Department of Defense. Whitfield opened his mouth. Closed it. His face had gone the color of old parchment. Furthermore, Vance continued, your interference with her clinical judgment endangered her ability to protect this patient. Captain Holt was her responsibility. Not yours. Never yours. Colonel Torres stepped forward with his tablet, reading the official statement in a voice that sounded like thunder being formally documented. The U.S. Military Liaison Office for Seattle General is recommending immediate termination of Dr. Marcus Whitfield's hospital credentials and privileges. His actions constitute a security breach and endangered a classified operative. But what came next was worse. They brought Captain Holt to the conference room in his hospital bed. His eyes had been closed for 3 weeks. Now they opened. His pupils tracked. His jaw moved. His voice emerged like gravel being crushed under boot heels. She carried me. 8 kilometers. Shattered spine. The whole way. Through Ramadi. He looked directly at Whitfield. While you were sleeping, she was dying to keep me alive. That's not overstepping. That's mercy. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then Dr. Carlisle stood up. Marcus, you told me this woman was an incompetent nurse with fabricated credentials. You had me initiate a state investigation based on lies. I thought, Whitfield started. You thought you could destroy someone's career because she made you feel small, Carlyle said, and her voice held the weight of someone watching a man's entire world collapse into a single moment of truth. You weaponized your authority against a decorated military officer. Against a woman who saved the life you wanted to let die. The board vote was unanimous. Whitfield's credentials were revoked. Not suspended. Revoked. His malpractice insurance was notified at 1,130 hours. By 1,500 hours, 3 lawyers had already filed civil suits. By that evening, the news crews had the story. The footage was perfect. Whitfield being escorted from Seattle General's main lobby in the late afternoon light, his belongings in a cardboard box, his face the color of ashes. Staff members lined the hallway in silent witness. Nobody looked away. Nobody looked angry. They just watched, and their silence was louder than any condemnation could have been. The video went viral before sunset. Within a week, 3 other hospitals declined his applications. His medical malpractice insurance premiums tripled. His wife took their daughter to her mother's in Portland without leaving a forwarding address. 2 months later, the state medical board suspended his license pending investigation into patterns of abuse documented by 17 nurses, 17, who came forward after Elena's story broke, each with their own testimony of his cruelty, his condescension, his systematic erosion of their professional authority. 6 months later, someone from Seattle General spotted him at a strip mall in Tacoma. A folding table. A laminated sign advertising supplemental insurance policies. A stack of business cards that nobody took. He sat there 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and watched people hurry past without making eye contact. But that wasn't where the story ended. At the Pentagon, Elena Martinez stood in dress blues, her actual dress blues, the ones with the shoulder boards of her rank, while the Secretary of the Navy read a citation that made 20 officers in the room go rigid with understanding. 3 Bronze Stars. Each one announced separately, each one given its own moment of silence before the next medal was spoken aloud. 2 Purple Hearts. Meritorious Service Medal. And finally, the Distinguished Service Medal, awarded for 8 years of service in civilian cover that no one had been allowed to acknowledge until the moment truth burned through everything else like a thermite charge. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She didn't do anything except stand there with her hands at her sides and accept what she'd already earned a decade ago. After the ceremony, Captain Holt rolled himself. He was walking short distances now, his physical therapy accelerating since he remembered who he was and what she'd done, to where Elena stood in the reception hall. He reached into his jacket pocket. His fingers emerged clutching something small and tarnished, a challenge coin so worn that the emblem had nearly smoothed away. "You left this with me," he said quietly. "In Ramadi. I didn't know why I kept it all those years. Even when I couldn't remember your face, I knew it meant something." He pressed it into her palm. Her fingers closed around it automatically, muscle memory from 8 years of carrying it in her own pocket, pressing it into the hands of operators who wouldn't come home. "Now I know," Holt continued, his voice rough. "It means you never leave anyone behind. No matter what they ask you to do. No matter what they order you to forget." Elena nodded once. Her composure didn't crack. It never had. But something in her chest unclenched, something that had been held tight since the night she'd carried him through enemy fire and been ordered to forget it ever happened. She pocketed the coin. 6 weeks later, Elena's photograph hung in Seattle General's main hallway with a plaque underneath, Master Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez, Naval Special Warfare. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. The trauma ward implemented new protocols. Every nurse's clinical concern now received full attending review. No exceptions. Dr. Chen personally oversaw the changes, his way of apologizing for walking away from a patient everyone said was dead. Elena returned to night shifts. Her hands were still steady. Her face was still composed. But now when she moved through the trauma ward, other nurses watched her differently. Residents stopped mid-sentence when she entered a room. Young doctors asked her opinion instead of assuming her experience was limited. Every Thursday, Captain Holt came for physical therapy. He was walking now, mostly, his coordination improving with each session. Sometimes he watched Elena work, moving through the ward with that same practiced efficiency that had kept him alive when everything said he was supposed to die. Neither of them talked about Ramadi. There were some stories that belonged only to the darkness. But sometimes Holt reached into his pocket and felt the weight of that challenge coin, and he understood something that General Vance had known from the moment he read that classified file: some people spend their entire lives earning recognition they'll never receive. The real victory isn't in the medals. It's in the living. If you've ever worked a job where nobody knew what you were actually capable of, where you kept quiet while someone else took credit or tore you down, you understand Elena's story. That's what happens when quiet competence finally meets the light. That's what happens when the truth arrives like reinforcements from the sky. If this story resonated with you, subscribe for more videos about the quiet heroes nobody sees coming. Like this video and comment below. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who you actually were? Let's talk about it.